Hey there, it's Brad. As someone who's passionate about podcasting, I've always thought there should be more support for physicians who want to share their stories and expertise. That's why we're launching Doctor Podcast Network.
We're bringing together a community of physician podcasters with one goal in mind: to provide the tools, connections, and resources you need to grow your show. So whether you've been podcasting for a while or maybe you're just starting, we've designed this network to support you every step of the way, and we're going to help each other rise, not compete.
If this sounds like something you benefit from, we'd love for you to join us as we get closer to launch. So you can sign up at drpodcastnetwork.co for early access. Stay tuned for more details in the coming weeks. Really looking forward to what we can create together. Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we have a super special guest. I recently met her at Peter Kim's Passive Income MD conference, and she told me that I was shooting all over myself. So when I heard her say that, I was like, this person's full of great advice, and I definitely need to have her on the show. To be clear, shooting all over myself, because I was saying, I should be here. I should be doing this already. This is what I should have done. And she is a verbal smack up in the head. Cut it out, Brad. Stop shooting all over yourself. On today's episode, we have Dr. Laura Suttin. She's a family physician, a certified coach, consultant, author, speaker, and an entrepreneur. She finished her medical training at McGovern Medical School in Houston, her residency at Christus Spohn Memorial Family Medicine Residency Program in Corpus Christi, Texas, and went on to get her MBA from the University of Texas, Dallas in 2016. She began working with a coach over 10 years ago, found it so life-changing, she became a coach herself. And she launched the Purposeful MD in 2021 with the mission of empowering physicians and other medical professionals to create the lives they love without guilt, which is why she wrote the book, The Purposeful MD, Creating the Life You Love Without Guilt. So, Dr. Suttin, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you.
So you have an origin story. That's why you became a coach yourself, because you wanted to, like, so to speak, spread the gospel in how life-changing it was for you and share it with other people. So give us a little more detail about what happened.
Yeah, I'm the coach that I needed about 10 years ago. I was a single parent at the time. I'm remarried now. In my MBA program, was a rising physician leader in my organization, and really just felt very stuck and difficulty moving forward. Just had a lot of the same beliefs that I see in physicians, that we have to do everything ourselves. We can't ask for help. And I started working with a coach, as you mentioned in my bio, that was actually somebody assigned to me as part of an executive leadership program. And my coach was so good, and she saw through the kind of the BS that I was telling myself, and she saw a side of me that I didn't even know that I had. She saw that I had more potential than I was giving myself credit for. So she really empowered me and helped me to move past some of these blind spots I have, crush some of the beliefs that I have been telling myself for so long, some of the beliefs that a lot of us physicians tell ourselves about what we can and we can't do, and really just opened the pathway for me to succeed as a physician leader, and now as a business owner and as a coach myself, and as an author.
So you hadn't hired a coach for yourself. You were assigned a coach?
Yeah. So it wasn't a hospital system, a medical group that I was a part of at the time. I was becoming a medical director, and through this physician leadership program, they assigned each of us a coach. So I know there's still a lot of stigma sometimes around coaching, and people get assigned coaches. Sometimes means they're disruptive. I was not a disruptive physician, but all of us as rising physician leaders were assigned this particular type of coach to work with. And I actually still work with her. I've been working with her now for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
So she's a big part of my success.
Because most of the time when I hear these stories, it's not that from people who've been assigned a coach. It's like, I sought it out because I found out from other colleagues that it had been something that worked for them and changed my life. It's not typical that someone outside, because I think for coaching to work, you need to be receptive to it. And
yeah,
not everyone's
you do.
in your headspace.
Sometimes being assigned a coach can have some backlash, but it can work. It's worked for me. And I've also been on the other side of that where I've been the coach that's assigned to somebody. And as long as the person's receptive to coaching, and I was new to coaching at the time, I didn't know what it was or what it meant. But yeah, it worked for me enough to the extent that I became one.
Another coaching success story. We're looking to have more of those. I think it's very underutilized in our field. There are a lot of evangelists out there that are talking about how amazing it is, but I still think we're really only scratching the surface, what it could help us accomplish.
I absolutely agree.
So your book, The Purposeful MD, the title, do you mean on purpose or with purpose?
Both, either one.
Okay.
And that's the name of my business. It was when I was creating my business a few years ago, it was just a word that really spoke to me. And so I think it's really all about being with intention in this world and acting with purpose and on purpose. I think that it's definitely about creating whatever you want for yourself. And I think that's one of the things that I see physicians not even wanting things anymore. We tell ourselves that we can't have things that we want. And how do we allow ourselves to want something?
What do you mean?
A scribe, for example. I've seen that all the time. I want a scribe, but I can't have one. Or I want to take a half day off a week so I can catch up on charts, but I can't do it. Or even something that's more within their control. I want somebody to come clean my house once a week. Or I want to have somebody come cook dinner for my family once a week. Or whatever that is, that we want things, but we tell ourselves that we can't have them. And so I think it's okay to want things, and it's okay to have things and ask for things. And that when we are acting with our purpose and with this intention, when we know what it is that we want and why it is that we want it, then we can move towards it in a more skillful way. And we reduce a lot of the stress that comes with having to make decisions on things over and over again, or just being weighed down by inaction.
So I'm understanding more what you mean by both with purpose and on purpose. So with purpose is really what you want to achieve. What is your purpose? What are your big goals? And then on purpose is more like, rather than just letting the health system do what the health system is going to do and you find your way along in there, on purpose means not by accident, but rather than letting life decide for you, be more intentional about all of your actions and how your day looks and how your day goes and what assistance you have versus not. And actually to the issue that you described, that person won't need a half a day off to catch up on their notes if they have a scribe. So we've killed two birds with one stone there.
Yeah, absolutely. I've coached a ton on that. And I mentioned in my book about physicians that I have known and worked with, colleagues and clients who've taken days off just to catch up on charts, which is heartbreaking to me.
They need to speak to our mutual friend, Junaid Niazi, who was also at Passive Income MD and has been on the show previously and can help them to conquer their charts. But also we've got ambient AI now, or we can have scribes. There's Freed.ai, who's a sponsor of the show. Lots of different ways to help manage it. But if you're just like building along, waiting for life to happen to you, very different than taking, what are my points of friction? What's really giving me trouble that's causing me all these headaches? And how can I manage them? Being on purpose.
Yeah. And how can we take back the agency that we have? Thinks of physicians as having an incredible amount of power and influence in our day-to-day lives. And we often feel like we don't, but we give some of that up. We really do. And I'm not discounting a lot of the challenges that our physicians today face. And I think that we need to step back or step up and take some of that agency back so that we can step into our own power and realize, hey, if it weren't for me, if it weren't for the physician here, these patients wouldn't show up. They don't show up to see the clinic administrator. They don't show up to see the medical assistant. They don't show up to see the physician. And so how can we leverage that? And how can we just remember that we really do have a lot more power and agency than we tend to think we do?
I love it. So another thing that I want to talk to you about is, it just so happens that I did an interview a little while ago with John Lundell. And I asked him, what are some issues that you would like to hear on the podcast? And he's, I think you should cover work-life balance. And who's a great person? Laura Suttin. You should have her talk about work-life balance on your show. Oh, that's amazing. I'm going to be talking to her like next week. So let's talk about work-life balance. So first, give us a framework. How do you conceptualize work-life balance?
Yeah, it's going to be different for everybody and it's going to be different at different stages of life. So I think one way to think about it is it can shift and change, right? So you have small children. I no longer have small children. My youngest is 17. So that's a very different stage in life, right? When my daughter was small, it was all hands on deck in a different type of way for sure. So things are going to shift and change, and that's okay. That's natural. But we really want to be clear about what stage are we in life right now? Is there something that we need to prioritize over something else? And do we need to put something else on the back burner? Can we let something go? And really, the starting point of all of that is identifying what your values are. Go through an exercise identifying what your core values are at this stage in your life and designing your life around those core values. If one of your core values, just as an example, if somebody's core value is nature, how are they living in alignment with that value? If they live in a high rise in Manhattan, they're not living in alignment with that value. And that might be okay. That's their choice, but they're probably going to feel some frustration and some inner conflict. So if we know what our values are, again, it reduces those friction points. Like you said, we don't have to make as many decisions on what we are going to do with our life, with our days, when we know what our values are. As an example for me, my daughter's a senior in high school this year. She's probably going to move away to college. And I am prioritizing time with her over things that I might prioritize in a different year, a different stage in my life, because a year from now, she's going to live probably 2,000 miles from me. And that's okay. That's a decision I made intentionally. And then I don't have to decide every single time. Setting out values from the get-go can be really helpful.
So that's interesting because one of my guest hosts, Coben Solberg, he's done some interviews here. He has recently become my financial advisor. And so when we talk about how we spend our money, it's the same idea, right? You're talking about spending time. He's talking about spending money. What are your priorities right now in this moment? What are your goals? And so then you shift your schedule around so that you are giving the appropriate amount of attention based on what your priorities are, rather than my leftover time goes to X, my leftover time goes to Y. So first, what are your values? What are your priorities? And then you can start working towards making sure they're in balance. And so that's more big picture, right? Mm-hmm. What's more like brass tacks, like scheduling, calendaring, journaling, like what are the things that you're doing to help you manage
so
their time?
Once you are clear on your values, then it's okay, what does this translate to in daily life? So family, I'll use my daughter as an example. She's 17. So I have to be really clear about what are the things that I want to do with her in a given day, week, month, year. We're coming up in the holidays. So we're talking about what does it look like to have a fun holiday and a relaxing holiday over the next couple months. Then I'm clear on her being a value of mine, family being a value of mine. How do I translate that? Are there certain activities that we do together as a family that I want to make sure we do? Maybe it's certain traditions, or maybe it's a weekly movie night, or maybe it's we have breakfast together every day. Defining what that looks like and how that fits into your day, and then scheduling it and making time for it. And we have to make the time. The time doesn't just find us. It doesn't just happen. But getting really crystal clear on what that looks like and how to translate that in your daily life, putting it on a calendar, and it's a non-negotiable. And again, things can shift and change. If a certain week things are off, you can always change it. Everything's flexible. But also realizing, you use the example of money, different people are going to want to spend money on different things based on their values. And it's the same with time. When we start comparing ourselves to how our colleagues or our friends or even our partners spend their time, then we can get really caught up in this. Like you said, I should be doing this, or I should be doing that. My partner's doing this. My colleagues are doing this. My friends are doing this. But if we're living out what is important to us, then we just feel so much more joyful and our cup is full.
Yeah. I can look at someone like Peter Kim and be like, look at the empire that he has built. Why haven't I done something like that yet? And I can feel badly about myself, or I can look at my day and be like, listen, when I get up in the morning, rather than working on a business plan, I'm going to have morning snuggles with my kids, because they're eventually not going to want those morning snuggles. In fact, I'm already short on time. Those morning snuggles are rapidly disappearing. And so then, okay, what can I do with my morning now that is in line with my priorities? Am I going to use it for exercise? Am I going to use it for my podcast business or the podcast network? Like, how am I going to use that time? So really, again, I'm using that time on purpose rather than being like, oh, what should I do? So being very intentional with that time. And I guess that kind of answers the question about balancing self-care and childcare and patient care, which always seems to be this so fluid. Do you have any other advice for that seeming impossible balance that we try to strike?
Yeah, a couple things. So just realizing again that we can't do everything and we can't have a perfect job and a perfect home and perfect spouse and perfect children and perfectly clean house. And just, first of all, there's no definition of perfect. We define it, we create it. So we have to be really clear on if we're going to prioritize some things, and we have to let go of some other things. We have to delegate or ask for help or just realize that, hey, maybe a fresh home cooked meal is just not going to happen every night. And that's okay. Another thing to keep in mind is that self-care is going to look different for everybody. So self-care, this vision of self-care that we have is like Calgon, take me away, bubble baths, massages, a spa day. And this is a lot of what women think, and I'm making a generalization, but that doesn't have to be self-care. That's not going to be self-care for everybody. So that's not self-care for me. Self-care for me is meditating for 5 minutes or taking a couple of deep breaths when I'm stressed or seeking out support when I'm frustrated about something, texting a friend or asking my partner for a hug or cuddling on the couch with the dog. Coaching, exactly, doing what I love. And so self-care doesn't have to take extra time. Self-care can be, okay, I'm about to walk into an exam room and this patient has been challenging for me to communicate with. I'm going to take 3 deep breaths before I go into this room. That is self-care. Self-care can be recognizing that I am setting very unrealistic expectations for myself and I'm going to loosen those. Or I've been talking to myself in a really critical voice and I'm just going to be more aware of that and ask if that's helpful for me. That can be self-care. So it doesn't have to be, oh, I'm going to go on a retreat for a week or some of these other things that we tend to think are self-care. Self-care can be really simple things of just being kind to ourselves and treating ourselves like we care about ourselves, because we do.
So self-compassion, which is something I don't
Yes.
think I've talked about self-compassion on a show for a long time. We've got some past episodes on it, but it sounds like that's what you're saying is a critical
Yes.
piece to self-care is self-compassion, which is not time consuming.
Self-compassion, how much time you got? We could talk about self-compassion for a long time, but yeah, it doesn't take time. It takes practice,
We're
but
going
it
to.
doesn't take extra time. Yeah?
So we're going to talk about it because the word that you used in the title of your book that we haven't spoken about yet, and that's guilt.
Yeah.
Creating the life you love without guilt. So why did you
Yes.
include that word in your title?
Because guilt is not required. And we feel guilty for things that we don't need to feel guilty for. I had a coach once tell me guilt is for criminals because I was feeling guilt about something. And she said, "Did you commit a crime?" And I said, "No." So she said, "Maybe you don't have to feel guilty." That guilt comes from maybe it's our upbringing, or maybe it's a training environment that we were in that taught us that we have to suppress all of our emotions or put everybody else before us and put ourselves last. And if you don't, then you're not going to make it in this business, or you're not going to get that coveted internship or rotation that you want. And so there are real consequences when we're younger and some of these beliefs that we have and these behaviors of self-sacrifice and self-criticism and that type of thing. So guilt comes from that voice, and so it can be really powerful because that voice helped us to get ahead at some point, but it's not serving us any longer. So just even recognizing like, hey, I'm feeling guilty about this. Maybe I don't have to feel guilty. Maybe that guilt is coming from an ancient part of me or an ancient voice that isn't helping me any longer, and really seeing it from just a different perspective. And that's where having a coach can be so helpful, to just be an objective party who cares about you, who can take a look at the situation with you and really question some of the old beliefs that we might have about ourselves. Because when we feel guilty, nobody wants to move towards that. We're going to move away from it, and it's going to cause us to shut down. So when we feel guilty, we can't make anything happen.
It sounds like we shouldn't feel guilty about prioritizing our well-being over patient care necessarily, meaning you should do the right things by your patients, But if you can't squeeze in every patient and add on every patient that needs you because you have your own life to lead, you shouldn't feel guilty about that. And I
Right.
think that seems like the recent Wall Street Journal article, or op-ed rather, where a surgeon was saying that the new generations of physicians see it as a job and not a calling. And so
Right.
therefore aren't able to make the self-sacrifice necessary to do their duty. There's this like,
Yeah.
you have an obligation to your patients and a duty to sacrifice of yourselves. And this younger generation is more interested in work-life balance.
Yeah.
What
I
are
read that
your
article. It was
thoughts
very
on that?
interesting.
Because it seems like you're on the side of work-life balance, not on self-sacrifice.
Because we're seeing what this generation that came before us and that we're still feeling, we're seeing what that is doing, that notion of self-sacrifice at all costs. We're losing physicians to suicide at a rate of one physician every day. So we are paying the price of that concept and that old style work ethic. And we're all going to work hard, right? Nobody becomes a physician without working hard. It's not that we're not working hard and taking care of patients, it's still sacrificing. But there has to be some sort of balance, and there has to be some sort of point at which we say, hey, if I'm not taking care of myself physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, then I cannot take care of patients in the way that they need to. Patients are getting sicker. We know that patients who are seen by physicians that are burned out have worse clinical outcomes. So all the data and all the evidence points to physicians have to be taking care of themselves. It's not even a question. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but you asked for my thoughts on that. So yes.
It is a self-selecting group that's listening to the show that definitely is in agreement with what you're saying. So your book, The Purposeful MD, is there anything from that book that we haven't spoken about today that you would want your readers to take away when they read your book?
Yeah. So it's about time management, but there's nothing in there about productivity hacks or time blocking or anything like that. It's all about how do you tackle the mindset that's involved in creating time for yourself. And I always say creating time or making time, not finding time, because we truly can make and create the time that we want for ourselves. And so how do we uncover what are the limiting beliefs that we tell ourselves? How do we set boundaries for ourselves? How do we manage the emotions that come up? So I talk about the guilt in the book, working through the guilt. How do you create confidence for yourself and get into action? So very actionable. Each chapter I have journaling prompts. I have ideas for the readers or soon to be listeners. I'm recording the audio version to really take action. It's not just about reading about the concepts. It's about taking action. Very doable, very actionable. That's really what I wanted to create with the book.
I love it. And you have your own podcast as well.
I do. The Purposeful MD podcast. Yes.
Where can people find you, your podcast, and your book?
Yeah. So my podcast is available on Apple and Spotify. The best place to reach me is at my website. It's thepurposefulmd.com. You can purchase my book on my website as well and find my podcast there. And my book is also available at all major online retailers as well. So
fantastic. Dr. Laura Suttin, the Purposeful MD, thank you so much for your time and all you do for your patients and for other physicians.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review, something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.